Rain came down over Wexford like the city had been holding its breath for months and finally let go all at once. It didn't fall so much as a tack, hissing off the pavement, turning gutters into small rivers that dragged the night's grime toward the storm drains. Through all of it walked a woman who had nothing left to lose to the weather, because the weather was the least of what had already been taken from her. The car moved through Wexford's flooded streets without a sound, the city's neon smearing across the wet windows like something out of a fever dream. Mary sat with her duffel on her lap and her mother's medical bag pressed against her side, watching the buildings grow taller and colder the further they drove. Robert Finley said nothing the entire ride, his head resting against the seat, eyes closed but not asleep. She could tell the difference. She'd spent enough nights watching patients fake rest to know what real sleep looked like. And this wasn't it. This was a man forcing his body to be still while his mind stayed on guard. The car finally stopped beneath the private entrance of a tower that seemed to disappear into the storm clouds above it. A private elevator swallowed them whole, climbing in silence until the doors opened onto a penthouse that looked less like a home and more like a vault someone had decided to live inside. Steel accents, reinforced glass, a control panel by the door blinking with more security features than Mary had seen at the hospital's pharmacy lockup. She stopped just past the threshold, and when Robert noticed she wasn't following, he turned back with something close to impatience. "Before I take one more step into this place," Mary said, "we're going to be clear about a few things." That stopped him. She watched surprise flicker across his face again, the same look he'd worn in the rain when she refused his money. "I'm not your nurse in the way you're imagining," she went on. "I'm not staff, and I'm not whatever else it is you think you're by with an offer like that. I sit with you until sunrise, like you asked. That's it. I get my own room with a lock on the inside. Nobody comes in without knocking. And the second I want to leave, I leave. No arguments." For a moment, he only studied her, rain still dripping from his hair onto the marble floor. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle her more than his silence had. "Fair terms," he said. "You'll have your lock." He said it like the request cost him nothing, which told her more about the kind of man he was than anything else so far. Men who negotiated that easily either didn't care what she asked for, or they were confident they could get around it eventually. She filed that thought away and followed him deeper inside. A man was already waiting near the far wall when they entered, broad, gray at the temples, standing with the stillness of someone who'd spent years learning to be invisible until he was needed. His eyes moved over Mary once, quick in assessing, then settled back on Robert with open concern. "You're bleeding again," the man said flatly, no greeting first. "It's handled, Desmond." Robert nodded toward Mary without elaborating further. She handled it. Desmond's gaze returned to her, longer this time, less suspicious now and more curious. "You're the nurse." "I'm a nurse," Mary corrected. "There's a difference between being a nurse and being the nurse. I'm not planning on becoming a fixture." Something in Desmond's face eased slightly at that, like her sharpness was reassuring rather than off-putting. "Desmond Reed. I run security for Mr. Finley." He said it simply, without the swagger she might have expected from someone in his position. "If you need anything and he's not available, come find me." Before Mary could respond, another voice slid into the room, smooth as oil poured over water. "Well, this is a surprise." A second man appeared from a side hallway, dressed sharper than anyone had a right to be at this hour, his smile arriving a half-second before the rest of his expression caught up. Robert doesn't usually bring guests home, especially not ones who look like they just walked out of a hospital drama. "Victor," Robert said, and something in his tone made it clear the introduction wasn't an invitation to linger. Victor either didn't notice or didn't care. He crossed the room toward Mary with an ease that felt rehearsed, extending a hand she didn't immediately take. "Victor Reyes. I handle the parts of this business Robert doesn't like getting his hands dirty with." His eyes flicked briefly to the medical bag she still held. "And you are—" "Tired," Mary said, "and not particularly interested in handshakes right now." Victor laughed, a short, delighted sound, as though her refusal was the most entertaining thing that had happened to him all week. "I like her already." Robert didn't look amused. Mary will be staying in the East Wing. Make sure she isn't disturbed. Of course. Victor's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, cataloging her in a way that made the back of Mary's neck prickle, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Desmond's warmth had felt solid, dependable. Victor's charm felt like a door someone had left ajar on purpose. Robert led her down a hallway lined with locked doors, finally stopping at one near the end. This one's yours. Locks on the inside like you asked. Mary stepped in, taking in the sparse, orderly room, and turned back to him before he could leave. One more thing, she said. Tonight, when I sit with you, I'm not doing for the money. I want that understood, starting now. Robert held her gaze for a long moment, rain still drying in his dark hair, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Understood, he said quietly. Just come when you're ready. He walked away down the hall, and Mary closed the door behind her, turning to lock herself, listening to it click into place. Outside, the storm hadn't let up. Neither, she suspected, had anything else about to unfold in this house of too many locks and not nearly enough answers. Mary found him exactly where she expected, sitting upright in a bed too large for one man, still dressed except for his ruined jacket, a lamp burning low on the nightstand beside him. He hadn't changed out his shirt with the torn sleeve, and for a moment she wondered if he'd simply forgotten or if some part of him needed to still feel the wound, needed the reminder that it was real. You didn't have to come, he said, not looking at her directly. You didn't have to ask. She set her mother's bag down near the door and pulled a chair closer to bed, close enough to be useful, far enough to keep the boundaries she'd drawn earlier fully intact. But here I am, so let's get this over with. He almost smiled at that, the same restrained motion she was beginning to recognize. Get it over with, as if sleep were a chore. For most people, no. For you, apparently, yes. She studied him in the lamplight. The tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw stayed clenched even in stillness, the restless motion of his fingers against the blanket. 3 years of this. Desmond had mentioned earlier in the hallway, almost in passing, like it was a fact everyone in the house had long since stopped questioning. 3 years without a full night's sleep. Mary had seen insomnia before, had nursed patients through it, and this didn't look like the ordinary kind. This looked like something that lived much deeper than tired eyes. Lie back, she said. I don't need to be told how to lie in my own bed. Then don't argue about it. She kept her voice even, the same tone she used on frightened patients who mistook her calm for indifference. It wasn't indifference. It was the only thing that worked. He lay back. Finally, though every line of his body stayed rigid, like a man bracing for an attack that never came. Mary watched his eyes move toward the window, toward the door, toward the shadows gathered in the corners of the room, cataloging exits and threats out of habit rather than necessity. It wasn't his body keeping him awake. His body was clearly exhausted, worn down past the point most people could function. It was something else entirely, something that refused to let his guard down even when there was nothing left in the room to guard against. You're not tired, she said slowly, working out as she spoke. I mean, you are, but that's not what's keeping you up. His eyes cut to her, sharp despite the exhaustion behind them. You a psychiatrist too? No, but I spent years watching people die, and I learned to tell the difference between a body that can't rest and a mind that won't let it. She held his gaze, unflinching. Something happens when you close your eyes, doesn't it? He didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wouldn't, and she almost let it go. Almost. I hear a heartbeat, he said finally, so quiet she barely caught it. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it slowing down. Mary said nothing, understanding settling over her with a weight she hadn't expected. She didn't ask whose heartbeat. Some questions didn't need asking. Not this early, not from a man who clearly spent 3 years building walls around whatever memory lived behind those words. Instead, she reached into her bag and drew out the pocket watch, her mother's, worn smooth from decades of handling, the metal casing dull with age, but the mechanism inside still steady as the day it was made. She held it up so he could see it in the lamplight. My mother used this to time pulses, she said. Toward the end, when she got sick herself, I used to sit with her at night and she'd get frightened the same way you're frightened now, even if you won't say it out loud. So I'd hold this up to her ear, and I'd let her listen to it tick instead of listening to whatever was happening inside her own chest. She held the watch closer. It's steady. It doesn't skip. It doesn't slow down. If you need something to listen to instead of your own thoughts, this doesn't lie to you the way memory does. Robert stared at the watch for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then, slowly, almost against his own will, he let his head fall back against the pillow. "Try it," Mary said softly. "Just try it. If it doesn't work, I'll sit here in silence instead, and you can glare at the ceiling all night for all I care." That earned the faintest exhale from him, not quite a laugh, but close enough to count. He closed his eyes. Mary held the watch near his ear and let the ticking fill the space where his thoughts usually crowded in, steady, patient, unbothered by whatever ghosts lived behind his eyelids. Minutes passed. His breathing began to slow, matching the rhythm of the watch rather than fighting it. The tension in his jaw eased first, then his shoulders, then the white-knuckled grip he'd had on the edge of the blanket, without either of them noticing. By the time the storm outside finally quieted to a drizzle, Robert Finley was asleep. Not the restless half-sleep of a man keeping watch, but something deeper, something real. Mary sat there long after his breathing evened out, the watch still ticking softly between her fingers, and allowed herself, for the first time that night, to feel something other than exhaustion. She'd done this before, sat beside people in their worst hours. But she couldn't remember the last time it felt like this. Like she'd handed someone back a piece of themselves they thought was gone for good. The second night went easier than the first. Mary arrived at his door without being summoned, the watch already in her coat pocket, and Robert didn't argue when she settled into the chair beside his bed. There was something almost domestic about it now. This strange new ritual. The lamp burning low, the rain finally reduced to a soft patter against the windows, the watch ticking its patient rhythm into the quiet. He fell asleep faster this time, and Mary let herself believe, just for a moment, that the worst that was behind him. She was wrong. It happened somewhere past midnight. One moment Robert lay still, his breathing even, and the next his whole body seized, a violent jolt that sent the blanket sliding to the floor. His face twisted, some private horror playing out behind his closed eyes, and a sound tore out of him that made Mary's chest go cold. Not quite a shout, not quite a sob. Something caught painfully between the two. "Michael." His voice cracked around the name. "Michael, stay with me. Stay, don't you dare." Mary was on her feet before she decided to move, but she stopped short of touching him, some instinct telling her that grabbing a man mid-nightmare, a man who kept knives within reach and men fleeing from him in dark alleys, was not a wise decision. Instead, she said his name, low and steady, the same voice she'd used on frightened patients waking from anesthesia. "Robert, Robert, you're safe. Wake up." His eyes snapped open, wild and unseeing for a terrible few seconds, chest heaving like he'd run miles instead of laying still in a bed. Then recognition crept back into his face, slow and humiliating, and he pushed himself upright, dragging a hand down over his eyes as though he could physically wipe away what he'd just seen. "I'm fine," he said too fast, his voice rough with sleep and something raw beneath it. "You weren't a minute ago." He didn't answer. He sat with his elbows braced against his knees, breathing hard, staring at nothing, and Mary recognized the posture immediately. She'd seen it in mirrors, in her own reflection, on nights she'd rather not remember. "Michael," she said carefully, not a question, exactly, just laying the name down between them to see what he'd do with it. His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he'd shut the door on the conversation the way he'd shut every other one that came too close to something real. Instead, quietly, he said, "My brother." Mary sat back down, saying nothing, giving him the room to continue or not. 3 years ago. Robert went on, staring at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. "There was a deal that went wrong. I wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to be there either. But he came anyway, because he thought." His voice caught, and he stopped, started again. "He thought he could fix it before I did something I couldn't undo. He was wrong about that, too. You were with him," Mary said softly. At the end, Robert's eyes flicked to hers, sharp with something like suspicion, like she'd read his mind rather than simply understood the shape of grief when she saw it. I held him, he said finally. I counted his heartbeats because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I counted them getting slower, and I kept thinking if I just counted hard enough, paid close enough attention, I could will them to keep going. They didn't. He exhaled, long and unsteady. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there, counting, waiting for the moment it stops. Except now, it's not just his heartbeat I hear failing. Sometimes it's mine. Sometimes I can't tell whose it is anymore. Mary sat with that for a long moment, the silence between them thick with something neither of them had expected to share. Then, because it felt wrong to receive that kind of honesty and offer nothing in return, she said, I know what that's like, counting. He looked at her properly then, something shifting in his exhausted eyes. My mother, Mary said, she got sick when I was 23. Ovarian cancer, caught too late. The kind where the doctors stop talking about treatment and start talking about time. I was already a nurse by then, which everyone thought would make it easier. It didn't. It just meant I knew exactly what every change in her breathing meant. I sat with her every night for 6 weeks, and I counted too. I told myself if her pulse held steady, we had more time. If it dropped, I panicked, like panicking ever changed anything. She turned the pocket watch over once in her palm, feeling the familiar weight of it. This was hers. I used to hold it up to her ear near the end, the same way I did for you last night. I don't know if it comforted her or just comforted me. Maybe both. Robert was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an attention that felt different now. Not the wary appraisal of their first meeting, but something closer to recognition. Two people realizing they'd been carrying the same weight from opposite sides of the city. She'd be glad, he said eventually, that it's still doing some good. Mary looked up at that, surprised by the gentleness in his voice, so at odds with the man who'd sent 2 attackers running into the dark 2 nights ago. Try to sleep, she said instead of answering, because some feelings needed more time before they could be spoken aloud. I'll stay. I'm not going anywhere. He lay back down, slower this time, and when his eyes closed again there was less fear in it, like naming the wound out loud had loosened its grip, at least for tonight. Mary held the watch near his ear and listened to his breathing steady, and beneath her own ribs, something had shifted too. Quiet, unnamed, and impossible to take back. The call came in the middle of breakfast, Robert's phone buzzing once against a marble countertop, before he picked it up, listened for exactly 10 seconds, and set down his coffee without finishing it. Mary noticed a shift immediately, the way his shoulders squared, the way something cold slid down over his features like a visor closing. Stay here, he said, already reaching for his coat. That's not really how this works, Mary said. I'm not staff. Remember? He looked at her like he wanted to argue, then seemed to decide it wasn't worth the time. Fine, but you stay in the car. She agreed, mostly because she was curious, and told herself that was the only reason. The car took them across town to a narrow street lined with small shops, the kind of place that hadn't seen new paint in a decade, and probably never would. Outside a corner grocery, a heavy-set man in an ill-fitting jacket had an older shopkeeper backed against the shutters, his voice loud enough that Mary could hear pieces of it through the closed window. Something about payments, about deadlines, about respect owed. The shopkeeper's hands were raised, placating, while a young girl, maybe 6 or 7, clung to his leg with wide, frightened eyes. Robert was out of the car before Mary had fully processed what she was watching. He didn't shout. That was what struck her most. He crossed the street with an unhurried, almost lazy stride, and the enforcer's voice died mid-sentence the moment he registered who was approaching. Robert said something low that Mary couldn't hear, and whatever it was, it made the bigger man go pale and take an immediate step back from the shopkeeper, hands raised in the universal language of a man suddenly remembering his place. Robert leaned in close, said something else, and this time the enforcer nodded so fast it looked like his neck might snap. Then Robert reached into his coat, pulled out a fold of bills, and pressed them into the shopkeeper's hand before the old man could refuse, saying something brief that made the shopkeeper's rigid posture ease into something closer to relief. He was back in the car within minutes, expression unreadable, as though nothing at all had happened. You didn't have to explain that, Mary said carefully, watching him. I know. I'm not asking you to. He glanced at her sideways, something almost like gratitude flickering behind the guarded look. He's been squeezing that man for months over a debt that was paid off years ago. I only found out about it last week. A pause. The girl shouldn't have had to see that. Mary said nothing else, but she filed a moment away carefully. Another piece of man who kept contradicting every assumption she'd walked in with. That evening, a different kind of chaos arrived at the penthouse. Smaller, louder, and entirely more welcome. Mary's sister had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind an 8-year-old son, Eli, who'd been staying with a family friend, while Mary tried to get her own life stable enough to take him in properly. That arrangement had finally, mercifully, run its course, and Mary had spent the better part of the day quietly dreading how Robert would react to a child suddenly occupying space in his fortress of steel and silence. She needn't have worried, not at first, because Robert simply nodded when she explained and said the East Wing had more than enough room, in a tone that suggested the matter was already settled before she'd finished asking. Eli, for his part, showed no such restraint. He arrived clutching a backpack covered in dinosaur stickers and immediately began cataloging the apartment with a fearless curiosity only a child could manage, poking his head into rooms, running small hands along the smooth steel door frames, entirely unbothered by the armed men stationed discreetly near the entrances. He found Robert in the study that first evening, standing at the window with a glass of something amber he wasn't actually drinking, and marched right up to him without a trace of hesitation. "Are you the scary man Aunt Mary's living with?" Robert nearly choked. "Excuse me." "Desmond said you're scary, but you don't look that scary." Eli tilted his head, studying him with the frank assessment only children were capable of. "You look tired." "I am tired," Robert admitted, something in his voice caught between amusement and disbelief. "My mom used to get tired like that before she died," Eli said, matter of fact in the way small children sometimes were about enormous things. "Aunt Mary says counting helps. Do you count?" Robert glanced toward the doorway, where Mary stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. When he looked back at Eli, something in his hardened face had genuinely softened. "Sometimes," he said, "it doesn't always help. You should try drawing instead." Eli produced a folded piece of paper from his backpack with the seriousness of a man presenting state secrets, and unfolded it to reveal a crayon drawing. A lopsided yellow sun, a stick figure with dark hair standing beside a smaller figure with a ponytail, both of them under the sun's careful rays. "I draw the sun when I feel scared. It helps me remember morning always comes even when it's dark outside." He held the drawing out, entirely unprompted, and after a beat of visible hesitation, Robert took it, turning it over carefully in his hands like it was something far more valuable than a child's crayon sketch. "Thank you," he said quietly, and something in his voice had gone unsteady in a way Mary hadn't heard before, not even during the nightmare, not even when he'd spoken his brother's name. Later, after Eli had fallen asleep in the unfamiliar room down the hall, Mary found the drawing pinned carefully to the corkboard in Robert's study, right beside a security schedule and a map of the city's east side, small and bright and entirely out of place among all that careful, guarded machinery, and exactly the kind of thing Mary suspected he needed most. It started as a favor, the kind Mary told herself she could refuse, but never quite did. Desmond had come to her a few days after the incident with the shopkeeper, a manila folder tucked under his arm and an apologetic look on his face that didn't suit him. "I wouldn't ask," he said, setting the folder on the kitchen counter where Mary was making tea for Eli, "but you're the only person in this house who can actually read a medical chart without their eyes glazing over." "What is it?" "Overdoses. 6 of them this month alone, all in the same 3-block radius near the old textile district." Desmond's jaw tightened. "Except something's off. The tox screens don't match what the victims thought they were taking. We think it's counterfeit product moving through legitimate-looking channels. Clinics, not corners. That makes it worse. People trust the clinic." Mary wiped her hands and opened the folder despite herself, old instincts pulling her before she'd consciously decided to help. Robert appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, watching her work through the pages with a quiet, careful attention she recognized now as his way of not interrupting when someone was focused on something that mattered. The files were a mess of half-answers, patient records, partial toxicology reports, blurry photographs of pill bottles with labels that looked legitimate at a glance, but were subtly, deliberately wrong under closer inspection. Mary had spent years reading medication charts, cross-referencing dosages, catching the kind of small inconsistencies that separated a clerical error from something more sinister. This had the fingerprints of someone who understood exactly how thin that line was, and how rarely anyone bothered to look for it. Whoever's behind this knows pharmacology, she said, flipping through lab results. Not just knows it, understands how to fake it convincingly. This isn't some street chemist cutting product in a basement. This is someone with real medical training. Someone who knows what a tox screen is supposed to look like and how to get close enough to pass a cursory glance. That narrows the list considerably, Robert said, moving closer to look over her shoulder. It narrows it to people with medical degrees who also have access to legitimate distribution channels. Mary kept working, cross-referencing supplier names against a list Desmond had compiled from clinic records, which is either a very small list or someone with enough money to make a very large list look small. Desmond slid another page across the counter. This one a printout from a pharmaceutical licensing board, a list of physicians whose names had come up in connection with several of the clinics receiving the tainted product. Mary scanned it without much expectation, mostly out of habit, the way she'd scanned 1,000 similar lists during her years at the hospital. Then she stopped, near the bottom of the page, alongside a string of credentials and clinic affiliations, was a photograph, small, official, the kind used for licensing records. A man in his 50s, silver at the temples, a practiced, camera-ready smile that had once made trusting patients feel safe in his care. Dr. Harlan Cole. The teacup slipped from Mary's hand and shattered against the counter, hot water splashing across the papers before she even registered she let go. She didn't move to clean it up. She couldn't. Her eyes stayed locked on that photograph, on that same composed, untouchable smile she remembered from the hospital review board, the one he'd worn while calmly explaining away a dead patient and an inconvenient nurse in the same breath. Mary, Robert's voice low, careful, cutting through the roaring in her ears. What is it? That's him, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her hands had started to shake. That's the doctor who prescribed the wrong dosage, the one who let a patient die and then made sure everyone believed it was my fault instead of his. The kitchen went very still. Desmond's expression darkened, the pieces visibly clicking together behind his eyes. Robert didn't say anything at first. He simply reached past her, picked up the page, and studied the photograph with an intensity that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "You're certain," he said finally, not doubting her, confirming it. I sat across from him in a hearing room for 3 hours while he explained, very calmly, very convincingly, that a 26-year-old nurse must have misread a chart under pressure. I've seen that smile in my nightmares more times than I'd like to admit. Mary's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for it. Hated that after everything, he still had that kind of power over her voice. He didn't just ruin my career. He let someone die and made sure I paid for it instead of him. Robert set the paper down slowly, and when he looked at her again, something had shifted in his face. The same cold, decisive quality she'd seen in the alley the night they met, the look of a man recalculating the shape of a problem now that it had a face and a name attached to it. "If he's connected to this," Robert said, "then he's not just responsible for what happened to you. He's responsible for 6 deaths this month, and probably more we haven't found yet." "Probably more," Mary echoed quietly, staring at the photograph until the edges of it blurred. Desmond began gathering the scattered files, his movements brisk and purposeful now, a man with a clearer target than he'd had 10 minutes earlier. Robert remained still beside Mary, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him, restrained but unmistakably present. "We'll find out exactly how deep this goes," he said, quiet enough that it felt almost like a promise made only to her. "And when we do, he'll answer for all of it. Not just what he did to you." Mary didn't respond right away. She only nodded, eyes still fixed on a photograph of the man who'd taken her career, her reputation, and nearly her will to keep believing in a profession she loved, never imagining, in her worst nightmares about him, that their paths would cross again like this. Mary hadn't expected to see him in person so soon, and certainly not outside Eli's school, standing beside a car far too expensive for the neighborhood, waiting with the patient stillness of a man who'd never once in his life doubted he'd get what he came for. Ms. Morgan, Dr. Harlan Cole, said her name the way he probably said everything. Smooth, unhurried. Each syllable placed with the calm authority of a man used to rooms falling silent when he spoke. You're a hard woman to find. I had to ask around. Mary's stomach dropped, every instinct telling her to grab Eli's hand and walk in the opposite direction. But Eli was still inside finishing an after-school project, and some old, foolish part of her needed to know what this man thought he had to say to her, after everything. You shouldn't know where my nephew goes to school, she said, keeping her voice level despite the anger climbing her throat. I make it my business to know things, Miss Morgan. It served me well. He gestured toward the open car door, an invitation she had no intention of accepting. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. I think you'll find it's worth your time. I don't have anything to say to you, but I have quite a bit to say to you, and I suspect some of it involves things you very much want to hear. He smiled, that same practiced, camera-ready smile from the licensing photo, the one that had once convinced an entire review board that she was a liar in the room. Your nursing license, for one, reinstated fully, with the review board's public apology on record. Your family's debts. I understand your sister left rather more of those than either you expected. Cleared entirely, no strings, no follow-up, all of it, in exchange for 5 minutes of your time and one signature. Mary went very still. A signature saying what exactly? A simple statement. That you misread the chart that night. That the tragedy was an honest clerical error on your part, made under significant stress, and that I bear no responsibility for a mistake I had no part in. He said it so easily, so reasonably, as though he were offering her a gift rather than asking her to bury the truth beneath a lie with her own signature attached. You'd be surprised how quickly people forget these things once the paperwork says what they want to hear. For one long, humiliating moment, Mary let herself imagine it. Her license back, her name clean, Eli's future secure, without the constant arithmetic of rent and groceries and school supplies that kept her awake some nights almost as badly as Robert's nightmares kept him. It would be so easy. One signature. An entire mountain of exhaustion would simply disappear. Then she thought of the 6 names in that case file. 6 people who trusted a clinic, trusted a doctor, trusted the same calm, reasonable voice currently offering to buy her silence, and had died for that trust while he stood in expensive suits explaining away the damage. No, she said. Cole's smile flickered, just slightly, the first genuine crack she'd seen in it. I don't think you understand the offer, Ms. Morgan. This isn't charity. This is the last kindness I intend to extend to you. I understand it perfectly. You're asking me to lie so you can keep killing people without consequences. Mary's voice shook, but she didn't look away. I refused to lie for you 3 years ago when I had nothing left to lose. I'm certainly not going to do it now. Everyone has something left to lose. His tone shifted, the warmth draining out of it like water through a cracked pipe. A nephew, for instance. A roof over both your heads. Certain associations you've made recently with people whose business dealings wouldn't survive close legal scrutiny. His eyes held hers, cold now, calculating. I'd hate for any of that to become complicated. Mary's blood went cold, but she kept her spine straight, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Is that a threat, doctor? It's a professional courtesy. I'm giving you every reason to make the sensible choice. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, holding it out toward her with 2 fingers, as though he were certain she'd take it eventually, as though refusal were simply a formality she needed to perform before arriving at the answer he already expected. Take a few days. Think about your nephew. Think about what kind of life you can give him with a ruined name and someone else's debts hanging over both of you. Mary looked at the paper for a long moment, then looked back at him, something settling into place inside her chest. Not fear anymore, but clear, quiet certainty she hadn't felt since the night she'd stood in her termination hearing and told the truth anyway, knowing exactly what would cost her. I already made my choice 3 years ago, she said. I chose it again just now. I'll choose it every single time you ask, so you might as well stop wasting your 5 minutes. She turned and walked back toward the school entrance without waiting for a response, her legs unsteady, but her resolve intact, refusing to look back even as she heard the car door close behind her and the engine start. It wasn't until she was alone in the school hallway, waiting for Eli, that her hands finally began to shake, not from doubt, but from the sheer effort of holding steady in front of a man who'd spent his whole life assuming money could purchase anyone's silence, and discovering for once that it couldn't purchase hers. Desmond found Robert in the study long after midnight, the drawing of the yellow sun still pinned to the corkboard behind him, and set a slim folder on the desk without a word. Robert looked up, reading something in Desmond's face he rarely saw there, not caution, not calculation, but something closer to grief. "You'll want to sit down for this," Desmond said. "I don't sit down for bad news. Just tell me." Desmond opened the folder anyway, laying out a series of printouts. Phone records, timestamps, a trail of encrypted messages his people had spent the better part of a week untangling. 3 months of financial transfers, routed through shell accounts that took some real effort to trace. They lead back to a private account linked to Harlan Cole. He paused, and the pause told Robert everything before the next sentence arrived. The other end of those messages is Victor. The room went very quiet. Robert didn't move, didn't reach for the folder, didn't do anything at all for several long seconds except stare at the papers as though staring hard enough might change what they said. "Show me," he said finally, voice low and controlled in a way that unsettled Desmond more than shouting would have. Desmond spread the rest of it across the desk. Message after message, Victor's own words laid bare in cold, undeniable text. Security rotations, travel schedules, the names of clinics they flagged for investigation, handed over days before Robert's people could move on them. And near the bottom, dated only a week earlier, a message that made something in Robert's chest go still and cold. "She's not just a nurse. He's attached. Use that if you need leverage. He's been selling us out since before Mary arrived," Desmond said quietly. "The counterfeit operation surviving this long, staying one step ahead of us every time we got close. That wasn't luck. That was Victor, feeding Cole everything we found before we could act on it." Robert set the papers down with a care that felt more dangerous than if he'd thrown them across the room. "Bring him to me, quietly. I don't want this discussed with anyone else in the building." Victor arrived 20 minutes later, still dressed for a night out, that same easy, unbothered smile in place, until he saw the folder open on the desk and Robert's expression behind it. The smile didn't fully disappear, but something behind his eyes shifted, recalculating. "Long night," Victor said carefully, testing the temperature of the room. "Sit down." Victor sat, though his eyes kept flicking to Desmond standing near the door, then back to the papers he clearly recognized without needing to read them closely. 3 months, Robert said, his voice quieter than Victor had probably braced for, which seemed to unnerve him more than volume would have. 3 months of feeding Cole every move we made. I trusted you with things I don't even tell Desmond. I trusted you near people I care about. Robert, don't. The single word landed with more weight than any threat could have carried. I've known you 12 years. I gave you a home when you had nothing. I made you family when you had none of your own. His voice didn't rise, didn't crack, but something underneath had gone raw, exposed in a way Desmond had rarely witnessed. And you sold every piece of that the moment Cole offered you enough money to make it worthwhile. Victor's composure finally slipped, something almost like shame flickering across his face before he covered with defiance instead. You don't understand what he offered, what I was drowning in before I took his money. You've never had to choose between loyalty and survival. Robert, not really, not with everything you built around yourself. I lost my brother, Robert said, and the room went colder still. I know exactly what it cost to survive something. I never once considered selling out the people who stood beside me while I did it. Victor had nothing to say to that. He sat in silence, the folder of evidence spread open between them like an unhealed wound. You'll leave tonight, Robert said finally. You'll take nothing that belongs to this house. You'll contact no one currently under my protection, and you'll pray that whatever debt you think you've settled with Cole is worth losing everything else you had here. He stood, signaling conversations end with finality that left no room for negotiation. Desmond will see you out. Victor rose slowly, some last flicker of the old charm attempting to surface even now. For what it's worth. It's not worth anything, Robert said. Not anymore. Desmond escorted him out without another word exchanged between them, and Robert remained alone in the study long after the door closed, staring at the message that had unsettled him most. He's attached. Use that if you need leverage. Feeling the full weight of what Victor's betrayal had actually cost, and what it might still cost before this was over. He was still standing there when his phone buzzed with an alert from building security, informing him of unusual movement near the warehouse district. The exact location, he realized with a sinking clarity, that appeared in the very schedule Victor had leaked days earlier. Cole wasn't waiting for a signature anymore. He was moving to strike, and thanks to Victor, he knew exactly where to find them. They dropped Eli at Desmond's sister's house just after dawn, the boy still half asleep, clutching his backpack and asking sleepy questions about why everyone looked so serious. Mary kissed his forehead and told him it was just grown-up business, an answer he accepted with the easy trust of a child who'd already learned to take comfort where he could find it. She didn't look back as the car pulled away, because she wasn't sure her composure would survive it if she did. Robert had barely spoken since the alert came in the night before. Mary recognized the look on his face now, the same cold stillness she'd seen the night they met, except sharpened by something personal this time, something that went beyond business and territory. Desmond drove them toward the warehouse district in silence, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel, 3 armed men following in a second car behind them. "You should have let me sit this one out," Mary said quietly, watching the abandoned factory slide past a window, rust and broken glass, and decades of neglect. "I considered it," Robert admitted, "but Cole's message made it clear you're part of his calculation now. Leaving you unprotected would have been worse." The warehouse Victor's leaked schedule had pointed toward sat at the edge of a long-dead industrial complex, its windows boarded, its loading docks overgrown with weeds that had pushed up through cracked concrete. Desmond parked a block away, and the 3 of them approached on foot, flanked by Robert's men, the morning fog still clinging low to ground like something reluctant to burn off. It was too quiet. Mary felt it before anyone said it aloud, the particular silence of a place holding its breath. Desmond felt it too. She watched his hand drift toward his weapon, his eyes scanning the rooftops with the focused intensity of a man who trusted instinct over reassurance. "Something's wrong," he said, just as the first shot rang out. Everything after that happened too fast to properly track. Muzzle flashes erupted from the windows above them, from behind stacked shipping containers, from angles Mary hadn't even registered as threats. Robert's men scattered for cover, returning fire, shouting instructions that dissolved into chaos the moment they left their mouths. Desmond grabbed Mary's arm and hauled her toward a concrete support pillar, shielding her body with his own as bullets chewed into ground where she'd been standing seconds earlier. Mary caught a glimpse of Robert through the smoke and confusion, moving with a controlled, deadly precision that told her exactly how many times he'd been in situations like this before, and how much it cost him to keep that composure, while the woman he'd sworn to protect crouched 30 feet away, exposed. It was over almost before she understood what was happening. A man appeared from behind the pillar Mary had thought was cover, his weapon already raised, angled directly at her chest. She had time to register the shape of the barrel, the terrible clarity of the moment stretching impossibly long, before Robert was suddenly there, moving faster than she thought a person could move, throwing himself into the space between her and the gun. The shot that was meant for her tore into him instead. He staggered, caught himself against the pillar, and Mary watched with horrifying clarity as a dark stain began spreading across his chest, far larger and far worse than the wound she'd bandaged in an alley days ago. Desmond took down the shooter with 2 rounds before the man could fire again, but the damage was already done, already spreading across Robert's shirt in a way that made Mary's training override the screaming panic in her chest. "Robert." She was at his side before she consciously decided to move, catching him as his legs buckled, lowering him to the ground with hands that had gone cold despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Told you," he managed, his voice already thinning. "Terms were fair. Don't talk. Don't you dare talk right now." Mary pressed both hands against the wound, feeling the warm, terrible flow of blood soaking through her fingers faster than she could stem it. Around them, the gunfire was dying down. Robert's men gaining control of the warehouse's perimeter, but none of it mattered to her beyond the immediate, narrowing world of the man bleeding out beneath her hands. Desmond. Her voice cracked with authority she didn't know she still had in her. I need the car close, now, and I need my bag from the trunk. This location isn't safe. Hospitals aren't safe with Cole watching every emergency room in the city. We need somewhere private, immediately. Desmond was already moving, shouting orders to the remaining men, his own composure fraying at the edges as he glanced back at Robert's increasingly gray face. Stay with me, Mary said, leaning close, pressing harder against the wound as Robert's eyes began to flutter, losing the fight to stay open. You hear me? You do not get to close your eyes on me right now. Not after everything. Count with me if you have to. Count anything. Just don't you dare stop. His hand found hers, weak but deliberate, and for one terrible moment Mary felt the same cold certainty she'd felt beside her mother's bed years ago, that some moments couldn't be fixed no matter how steady your hands were, no matter how badly you willed them to be enough. She refused to believe this was one of them. They carried him into the least ruined corner of the warehouse, a stretch of concrete floor beneath a section of intact roof, and Mary was grateful in some distant part of her mind that at least the rain had finally stopped. Desmond spread a tarp from the car's trunk across the floor, and two of Robert's men laid him down as gently as the urgency allowed, their faces tight with fear Mary recognized because she was fighting the same thing herself. Bag, she said, and Desmond pressed it into her hands before she'd finished a word. She worked the way she'd trained herself to work years ago, in a hospital corridor lit by fluorescent lights instead of gray morning through broken windows, methodical, fast, refusing to let her hands shake even as everything in her wanted to. She cut away the ruined shirt, assessed the wound with clinical detachment that felt like betrayal and salvation in equal measure, and called out instructions to Desmond in a voice that left no room for hesitation. Pressure here. Both hands. Don't let up no matter what you hear me say next. She guided his palms into place, then turned back to her bag, pulling out what little she had, gauze, suture kit, a bottle of antiseptic that wouldn't be nearly enough, and a small vial of the emergency clotting agent she'd started carrying since the night she'd first bandaged Robert's arm in the rain, some instinct telling her she'd need it again eventually. Hospital. One of the men said, hovering uselessly nearby. We need to get him to a hospital. Cole has eyes on every emergency room in this city, Mary snapped, not looking up from her work. The moment Robert shows up wounded at any of them, Cole finds out exactly where we are and exactly how vulnerable he is. This is the only trauma bay we've got. Now, either help or get out of my light. Robert's eyes were fluttering, losing their fight to stay open, his breathing shallow and uneven in a way that made Mary's chest tighten with fear she refused to let reach her hands. She pulled the pocket watch from her coat almost without thinking, pressing it into his palm and closing his fingers around it. Hold on to that, she said, leaning close enough that only he could hear her. You hear it ticking? Steady like I promised. You focus on that instead of whatever's trying to pull you under. You do not get to leave me counting alone. Not after everything. His fingers tightened weakly around the watch, and something in his glazed eyes sharpened just slightly, just enough. She worked for what felt like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes, packing the wound, controlling the bleeding with hands that had gone steady the way they always did once the panic had nowhere left to live except beneath her focus. Desmond kept pressure exactly where she'd place his hands, his own face pale but resolute, murmuring low reassurances to Robert that Mary suspected were as much for his own nerves as for his friends. When the bleeding finally slowed to something manageable, when Robert's pulse, checked against her fingers, pressed his throat, steadied into something she could work with instead of something she was racing against, Mary allowed herself one single breath of something close to relief. He needs surgery, real surgery, soon, she told Desmond. But he'll survive the drive now. Get your people you trust, and only the people you trust, moving toward that private clinic you mentioned before. Now! The days that followed blurred together in a haze of hospital corridors, hushed conversations, and Mary sitting vigil beside a hospital bed in a private wing whose existence she suspected very few people knew about. Robert drifted in and out of consciousness for the better part of 2 days, and each time his eyes opened, the first thing they searched was her face, and the second was the pocket watch she kept beside his pillow. ticking its steady rhythm through every uncertain hour. Cole's empire collapsed with a speed that surprised even Robert once he was well enough to follow the news. The evidence Desmond had compiled, combined with the ambush itself, and the trail Victor had unwittingly left behind before his betrayal was discovered, gave investigators more than enough to move on the counterfeit operation. Clinics were raided, distribution networks unraveled, and Harlan Cole, whose smile had once been convincing enough to end Mary's career with a single hearing, found that smile did very little for him in front of a courtroom full of evidence he could no longer explain away. Mary's license was reinstated within weeks, the review board's apology arriving in writing, formal and belated, and far less satisfying than she'd once imagined it would feel. It didn't matter as much as she'd expected it to, not anymore. What mattered more was watching Robert, weeks later, sitting on the balcony of the penthouse with Eli beside him, the two of them hunched over a fresh sheet of paper, while Eli explained, with great patience, the correct technique for drawing a sun that actually looked warm. That night, for the first time since Mary had known him, Robert fell asleep without the watch, without her sitting vigil in the chair beside his bed, without any ritual at all beyond simply closing his eyes and trusting that morning would still come. She found him the next day exactly where she'd left him, rested and unguarded in a way she'd never seen before, and when he looked up and smiled, not the restrained almost smile she'd grown used to, but something fuller, something unburdened, Mary understood that whatever they built together in that fortress full of too many locks had finally, quietly, become something worth calling home.